You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I am Sherry Lipp, the marketing manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here today with our CEO, Nathan Whittacre. And today we are going to be talking about a hot topic, the CrowdStrike outage. Welcome, Nathan.
And thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to Stimulus Tech Talk.
So this just recently happened as the recording of this podcast. So what do we know so far, Nathan?
Well, it's another day, another dollar, I guess. We just got over the outage with CDK for the car dealerships. It seems like yesterday. And now we're having another global outage that's causing major disruption for businesses. What we understand from it is, and it's a little complicated, but Microsoft released an update at about the same time that CrowdStrike, which is a security vendor, released an update. And those two updates conflicted with each other and caused about 8.5 million computers across the globe to what we call in the Windows world a blue screen of death, which means the computer reboots and it comes up to a blue screen and cannot continue past it without major intervention. So it took down over 8 million computers, and CrowdStrike is an enterprise security product. And so it was a lot of large companies that were affected by this, airlines, hospitals, insurance companies, and probably the most public one was the airlines. Delta alone had over 5,000 flights that were canceled, and they are saying that it caused about a $500 million loss in revenue for the airline. So major problem and disruption. I know a couple of people that were stuck at airports waiting for flights. And so it was certainly a major disruption for the travel industry. But not just them, it's affected a lot of other industries too, but mostly large businesses were affected by this.
So, and you weren't one of the people stuck at the airport.
I luckily was not. I've been traveling, and that's why we've been missing a few podcasts. So it took some time off in the summer to vacation with my wife and kids. But no, I didn't get stuck. Luckily, it was nice to be flying on airlines that weren't affected by it because I was traveling in the middle of this.
So one of the biggest questions I've seen is like, how could one? I mean, it was two things kind of conversely working together, but how could so many things be reliable on this one security update?
Well, so, there's certainly a lot of finger pointing going on right now. And I don't know if we'll ever know, publicly all the details about what occurred from a technology standpoint. Maybe we will. Sometimes they do release this, but there's supposed to be a review process between the security vendors and Microsoft, who writes the operating system, the underlying software that runs the computer. And it appears that there might have been a conflict in this review process. There's certainly an alternative vendor out there to CrowdStrike that has come out publicly and said that it's the way that the vendor was interfacing with CrowdStrike as a vendor was interfacing with the Microsoft operating system that was dangerous. Now, of course, that's a competitor that is saying this, but it is a concern. We rely on these IT systems and these well-known software vendors, whether it's the one that we talked about a couple of months ago, CDK, which was a cloud service provider that was hacked, or a security vendor that had an update that caused this major issue. As businesses, we're relying on these vendors to do the right things all the time. And humans make mistakes. Computers, just follow what we tell them to do. And sometimes these mistakes cause major damages to to businesses and potentially people. So that's what's interesting to me about this whole thing is, in the end, it is a human that caused this problem. That maybe a policy or procedure wasn't followed, or that procedure that was put in place that should have been followed wasn't good enough to prevent this type of outage. But in the end, somebody applied an update. These two vendors conflicted with each other, and it caused a major outage. And these were decisions that people made along the way.
And what do you think that does it give you any kind of more comfort to know that it was a human error or not like a malicious attack? I mean, human errors happen, or is
I
it
don't
is it
know.
it's just bad?
Yeah, it's just bad. I've actually been mulling over this the last couple of weeks as this has happened. You know, it's it's a hard industry. There's we just recently did an audit of all the tools and all the things that we use as a service provider to provide support for our customers. And the list was very long. We're relying on a lot of different tools and a lot of different solutions to make computers work. Just a side story, kind of to illustrate how much it's changed. We were looking at a graph the other day about AI and the adoption of AI in business, and the number of users. This was a graph, and we'll have probably a webinar on this very soon. But ChatGPT hit 100 million users in 3 months from being publicly released. All other technologies have taken years to reach that level, whether it's internet was tens of years, cell phones, social media, all of these took years. So the speed of technology has increased dramatically. And that led me to talk to my son. My son is a teenager, and he's into technology. He really likes his video games. He actually reminds me a lot of me at that age, young teenage years. I got into technology because I like video games. I like playing games. I had a Nintendo console. I had an Atari 800 XL that I played on. Eventually got a PC in my teenage years, and I tinkered with it because I wanted to make it run faster so I could play better video games. And I think about that, I was his age, and it was Microsoft DOS. I think it was 6.2 that was on my first PC. It was Atari was just booted up to a command line. I had to actually literally use basic programming language to get that computer to work. And that was not that long ago. It was 30 years ago. And in the time frame of like thinking about the world, 30 years to go from these text-based platforms, and even 30 years before that, it was key cards, and you'd have to know binary to use computers or maybe assembly language, to where we are today, that it's ubiquitous. And the way that systems today are easy to use for the user means that it's very complicated underneath. So the easier computers get to use, the more complicated they have to be. I know that sounds weird. It's a kind of an oxymoron. But it's the truth, to make computers and the internet work, and to make these systems work, and the cloud work, and the communications work. There is a lot of complicated software and coding and technologies that go in behind that, and there's just so many places for it then to fail. I like I mentioned before, I often fly, and I'm a pilot myself, and I fly in these commercial jets, and I look at this jet and I'm thinking to myself, how many systems are in place in these jets that have to all be running 100% right for this plane to fly, long distances. And that's the way computers are. Each one of our individual computers have so many different pieces and components that have to work all the time. And sometimes, whether it's by a malicious attack or sometimes by a human mistake or error, it's not going to work right, and it affects people in a bad way. Whether it's it could have caused maybe this health or an outage at a hospital could have caused somebody to die. It could cause loss to businesses. People not getting home. To appointments or whatever they need to be. It's very disruptive when these things happen. But we do have to remember it works most of the time. 99% of the time it's working just fine. But when these 1% issues or less than 1% issues happen, it's very disruptive to our modern society. So I think we need to be a little patient and understand that it's very we live in a very complicated world at times. So that's my thought on it. That was a long rant about my view on what's going on in the industry.
Well, it's kind of interesting. In our last webinar, you talked about the movie War Games, and in the movie, in addition to changing his grades around, he launches what's supposed to be a simulation, and there's a hidden vulnerability in there, and the computer thinks it's real, and that's the whole movie. But what that was 40 years ago. Sorry for people who were old enough to remember watching it in the theater, but and
I was one of those.
I watched it in the theater too, but those hidden vulnerabilities still exist. So what kind of lessons can small businesses learn from that kind of thing?
Well, I think it's the same thing that we were talking about the CDK strike. Is I think businesses need to find a process that they can not use technology to make it work. It might be slower, it might be harder, it might be inefficient, but when the proverbial crap hits the fan, businesses need to continue to operate one way or another. And I think we need to assume that these systems are going to go down sometime, and it's going to be disruptive. I think as a society, we need to have some patience at times, and I said this twice now, with companies, with our operations, with our industries, because we used to operate without computers. 40, 50 years ago, most small businesses were on pen and paper, and my parents were business owners, and that's what put this grain in my mind when I was young to be a business owner. But they operated it with ledger paper and calculators and a 10 key, and going to the bank to do deposits and cash or check, and they were able to operate successful businesses that way. And it can still happen. I mean, it's not impossible to operate without technology. And we having the right partnerships with vendors and professionals to put those systems in place that are as foolproof as possible, but still have a backup plan when things happen. I think it's also important to to constantly vet your vendors, whether it's your IT provider, whether it's a vendor you're buying software from, and just ask these tough questions. Is there a way I can get backups, and how do I continue operations if you go down? Those are really important questions to have discussions with your vendors about, to ensure that there's alternatives to their operations. Because I think CrowdStrike, CDK, all these outages show us that even large enterprises that are very trusted in the industry have issues, and it's incumbent on us as a small business owners to to constantly vet them, but also have alternative plans if things go awry. And there's, right now in the industry, there's a lot of finger pointing. I was reading that, Delta is reconsidering, their partnership with Microsoft, who's, by far the leader in enterprise computing systems, and it's hard not to do business today with Microsoft. And I'm not saying don't do business. I still strongly believe in their products. But everybody has problems, Apple, Microsoft, Google, everybody's had outages and everybody's had problems. And, I think if Apple suddenly, became the dominant leader in enterprise computing, they would have issues and targets on their back too. So it's not a quick answer to say, I'm going to jump ship and choose an alternative provider, because there's not very many, especially in these critical systems. There's only a handful of these, operating system vendors. I named the top three. There's those are kind of it. Microsoft, Apple, or Google with their Chrome OS. That's kind of it in the US. China has some alternatives, but we're not really using them here in the US at all. And they're kind of clones of Google or Microsoft. And then for these sensitive systems like CrowdStrike, there's really not a lot of alternatives. We use an alternative, but there's only probably about 5 or 6 highly vetted alternatives to CrowdStrike for next generation antivirus and cybersecurity protections. So, we have to work with these companies to ensure that there's that they're doing what they need to do, and you have some patience with them when they don't do what's right, because I can assure you that everybody's had problems, and I think we just have to go into technology assuming that everybody's going to have problems at some point.
Yeah. And do you think, we talked about this a little bit in our last episode about technology independence, but having that assessment, does that kind of show people where kind of their biggest pain points of where they would need backup or an alternate method if there was, a major outage like that?
Yeah, I think what I would say is what would affect the small business the most, and what we see day to day, aren't these outages by a large vendor like Microsoft. What occurs most is you have a server in your office and it goes down, or an attack such as a business email compromise, which leads to potentially ransomware or something like that. And so I think we need to focus our energy where the threat is most likely going to happen. So, having a risk assessment and focusing on the areas that are more than likely going to affect a small business is really important. So I'm glad you brought us back to that, looking at redundancy of your servers, looking at training your employees. The last webinar, we talked about the password management, making sure that your employee accounts have two-factor authentication on them and protect against the biggest and most likely threats to your organization. I think is more important for a small business to focus on than thinking about, I need to protect against Microsoft, and switch my entire operating system over to Google or Apple. And I bet you that, Delta's going to look at it and say, well, honestly, I don't know if there's an alternative to using Microsoft operating system. Maybe there's not. Maybe there's still, a portion they have to, even if they move over to, Amazon Web Services for their cloud systems and Apple for their desktops. I mean, maybe they choose to do that, but I'm sure there's something that they'll have to use from Microsoft in there. And I think from a small business standpoint, it's too hard to lift and switch those major vendors, but we can, protect against the smaller ones. If you have a cloud service, make sure it's backed up. That's why we feel it's essential if, for our customers that are using Microsoft 365 to do a third-party backup. Don't rely on Microsoft to back up your systems. You have a third party that's doing those backups. And we feel the same way if you have a server infrastructure, if you have, any type of cloud infrastructure, have a way to get access to your data and your systems if that vendor goes down, and don't use that vendor's backup solution. Use a third party backup solution to make sure that works.
And a final question, if you could tell a business owner one thing to do today to improve their network security, what would it be?
Oh man, Sherry, that's one of my least favorite questions. Is like, what's your favorite thing? What's your favorite ice cream? I don't have a favorite ice cream other than I like ice cream, you know? What's your favorite security thing? What is one thing? There definitely are a number of things. If you remember our webinar, we talked about business email compromise is one of the biggest security threats. So if you could do anything today to improve your security, is ensure that your email is secure. So whatever it needs to be in place to set up two-factor authentication, to have advanced email security protection, and then back up your cloud infrastructure. That's really where the big vulnerability is today. Is through that. So that's probably the number one thing I'd have businesses focus on. And then you could start, looking at all, having backups in place for your other infrastructure. But that's where security starts, is really the entrance into your systems, and that's the biggest entrance right now is through email that these hackers are getting into. So there's my favorite. There's my favorite answer is I have a whole list of things that are close number ones, but that's probably the number one right now.
All right. Right. Well, thank you, Nathan. Such great information and interesting topic that I'm sure that we'll keep talking about. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for being here. Have a great day.